Hello, welcome to everyone who is joining us for the When Data Meets Activism workshop that we have here. Today we have four activists who will help us understand the ability to, well, not the ability, but why it's important for us to have information and activism together, working together. We have lots of organizations that we work with, partners who prepare reports. They do lots of research, extensive research, which is very expensive. But when they are done with the research, it opens up the question, what do we do now that we have this information? Oftentimes, there are activists on the ground who are looking to push issues, who are looking to activate the community around the most important issues to their communities, but they need the information. Somewhere in the middle between those two, there's a gap. And Brightbeam likes to stand in the gap between the information producers and the activist on the ground. So that's why we call this When Data Meets Activism. My team is not going to love me for the thing that I always like to bring into this, I like to say, because I like to coin words. I like to make words up. So here's the word that I made up. Infovism. It's information plus activism. You put the two together, you have infovism. Now, no one else ever say that again because my team has made me swear to never say that again, ever. But I keep saying it everywhere I go, just because I think it is really important for information producers to know that the information they produce is going to have an effect in the world. Well, otherwise, why else are you doing all this research? Why are you doing all this work? And for activists, we want to make sure they're informed, because it's one thing to show up with the bullhorn and have no information. It's way more powerful to show up with a bag full of information and the bullhorn and say, let's get it, y'all. Let's get something started here. So I'm going to keep moving along here. I do want to tell just kind of a little quick story up front to say, years ago when I was an activist in Minneapolis, working on education issues, this story was real to me around whether or not I would have the information, because I actually would activate friends, family, others on issues. And oftentimes I would get into rooms and the decision makers and others would confuse me. They would tell me I didn't know what I was talking about. They would make me feel small. They would make me feel as though they were the holders of all of the information. And once I started developing the skill of looking things up before I came, and walking in with confidence, once that happened, my activism changed a lot, and it made it much harder for them to make me feel small in rooms. And it also made the people around me more powerful also, because we had the information and we could hold them accountable with it. One of the sites that I used to use was called Why Proficiency Matters, and it was a site that was run by ExcelinEd, actually. And it would highlight the gaps using national NAEP data. It would highlight the gaps between racial subgroups. But the cool thing about it was the way that it would display. It would display the information in a way that was really easy to understand. And I was able to usually take thumbnails and screenshots from it and put it in the social media and just pepper school board members, the superintendent, put hashtags on it. And I became a real pain for them. And I discovered my superpower. And my superpower was infovism, even though I didn't know it then, and I wasn't calling it that then. So Why Proficiency Matters ended. It ran its course. And when I took over at Brightbeam, we started working with ExcelinEd to say, hey, whatever happened to the site? How did you guys put it together? What is the data? Because we want to do something similar. And ExcelinEd was, they were such a good partner, good friend to us, that they gave us everything. They walked us all the way through it. They told us, how the site was devised and how it came together. So we started a partnership to get the site back up again. I'm going to walk you through a couple of slides that just show you a little bit about the frame of what we're looking at. We have the site launching back up again. Our thing is really using the data so that activists can push schools to work equally well for every child. And we know that's not working out for our kids. When you go into the site, you'll be able to find your state. You'll be able to highlight the data specifically for your state, and then display it in a way where you can tell, as an activist, you can tell what's happening with Black fourth graders in reading, in math, in 8th grade reading, in 8th grade math, in quick, easy ways that you can take this and you can shoot it to people. You know, in my state, 27% of Black 4th graders, you know, nearly a fourth, only, you know, a quarter, you know, a couple of points lower, of Black students in Minnesota, very wealthy state, are reading on grade level in 4th grade, for instance. So really this becomes a game about how you display information in ways that people can take it and run with it. So I'm not going to go very deep into the tool itself, just to say that we're launching it soon. We're also launching a way that you can take the data and take action with the data, so that, you know, information meets action. It's not just learning like what the numbers are, but it's also having something to do with it once you know what they are, and developing the data that activists need in the way that they need it. I'll end this by saying, so that we can jump right in with our activists, that we really need to understand what activists need themselves, so they have to tell us. We have all this information, all this data. We need to go to them and say, you know, here's the data set that we have, here's the information we have, here's the research. How do you see this as being useful in your community? How do you see this as working with your own work that you're doing? And that feedback loop has to be very strong, right? We can't just keep producing data for data's sake and then having activists on the ground look at it and say that does nothing for us. That does nothing, you know, to help us improve our lives. So with that, I would love to jump in and ask each of our activists to give a quick, brief, who you are, where you are, and what your activism is about. And in my screen, I'm seeing, you know, a left to right. So I'll start with you, Chioma. Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you are, and what's your activism about.
Great. Hi. So as you just said, I'm Chioma Oruh. I am an activist in the brightbeam network. My group in DC, my company in DC is called Bornfree. So we offer consultancy, family-centered consultancy to a range of people. And one of our key projects as part of the brightbeam work that we do is we created the Parent Advocacy Action Team. We're very disabilities centered here in Washington, D.C. And, you know, we're really having a great time and shaking things up around distance learning. So that's, I guess, my start, trying to keep it brief.
Thank you. Tanesha, who are you, where are you, and what's your activism about?
Hey, everyone. My name is Tanesha Peeples, and I am in Chicago, Illinois. I am the Deputy Director of Activist Development with brightbeam, and my activism is about making sure that all Black and Brown kids get the education that they need and deserve by any means necessary. That's it.
And, awesome. Garris, tell us a bit about you.
Sure. Hey, everyone. Garris Stroud. I am a teacher in rural Western Kentucky, former Kentucky State Teacher Fellow. And I've worn a couple of different activist hats. I helped launch an initiative in Kentucky called Stop the Shortage, which was a teacher recruitment initiative. And we've done some work with Go Teach Kentucky and kind of talked with some of the administrators in that program, just in about teacher recruitment in Kentucky and in rural areas in general, but specifically of diverse teachers and how we can create a pipeline in Kentucky for that. And then more broadly, we have also done some work with universal pre-K in Kentucky and with rural broadband access. So I'm happy to be here today.
And Natasha.
Hi, I'm Natasha, and I'm with Black Community Collaborative. And what we do is we work with the city as well as other community organizations in Chicago around creating solutions that are based primarily on data. So we collect data, we do research, and we bring that information to hold our elected officials, our school boards accountable for the needs of our community.
That's awesome. So thank you, all of you, for joining us today. I'd ask you a question just initially to put it out there. Do you buy the premise of the way that I set this up, that you know, information is key to your activism, and that people who produce it should do a better job of making sure that it's activist ready, that it's ready for you all? Do you buy the premise? And if so, why? What's your thought on the premise?
So I can start. Yes and no. So again, so I work very specifically with special education. So working with Black and Brown families of students with disabilities, whether they have an IEP or 504, or maybe they're not even identified at all. And so there's usually a narrow, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. There's usually a very narrow view of how data around special education, because there are state mandates around special ed. Some of it is public, but unfortunately, some of the really important data, sometimes states cloak it, and it's for a fact in DC, they'll cloak it under FERPA, which, some things that can be made public should not be hiding under FERPA for protections. So I think there's a huge opportunity for researchers in the private sector to push that question, where states may either not know or may not be interested, may not have the capacity, may feel embarrassed about what those findings may be. We don't have good data on park testing performance. We do know kids with disabilities are flatlining. We don't have any critical analysis over why or what. We know the graduation rates are abysmal. I can give you a pinpoint. We don't know Black and Brown performance standards and rates. So there are lots of things we don't know. And because of the privacy issues around this, special education, we're also losing opportunity to discover.
Anyone else can jump in. I just want to tag onto what you just said there. If the data is hidden, then it straight up is just data. It's not information until it actually becomes useful to someone. So what you just said to me, like data behind firewalls or data behind, like you just said, hidden in FERPA, is not information yet until somebody actually rescues that data and liberates it and then turns it into information for the people. So I love that example. Anyone else about the premise?
Yeah, I just want to jump in because, in my opinion, in doing organizing work for over 10 years now, information moves people. And in order to impact the change or influence the change that we want to see, people have to move. And so to have that information at our fingertips to actually move communities to push for the change that they need and deserve, we need readily available access to the information that will move people. And so especially when a lot of information is misconstrued. I know here in Chicago, they boast our graduation rates to say that, our students in the more marginalized communities are graduating at higher rates. But as Chioma said, our reading and math proficiency rates are below 20% for Black and Brown students. And so in my mind, I'm wondering how are Black kids graduating at a 78% rate now, but they can't read and do math. And so our communities need to know that information, that they need to know that data so that they can ask those questions, so that they can put pressure on our decision makers and our leaders to make the changes that need to be made to connect those dots and connect and really close those gaps. So that information is definitely needed.
I think that's a great point. I mean, you throw enough data at a community and it's easy to confuse them. So if you are a person in charge, if you are the decision maker, you can actually just keep the community confused with data.
Exactly.
And I think one of the other things that's very important to highlight in, using data as a tool to organize the communities is that it's a way to really activate, the people on the ground. And when you talk about, for example, what Tanesha saying, if people aren't aware that, yes, the graduation rate looks good, but yet there's this gap here with the reading scores and things of that nature, people really don't have a reason to move because they're like, oh, wait, things look good. But when you are able to really display, hey, this is what's actually happening, I think that lights the fuel. And in organizing, you need to have that in order to be able to, move policy. You got to move people first. So I think that's why it's important.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here too, just with an example from some of my work in the past couple months. I drafted an open letter to education leaders in Kentucky to bring back a program called the Kentucky Academy for Equity in Teaching, which was at one point sort of the premier diverse teacher recruitment pipeline for our state. And after the more people I talked to, the more I realized that people really like the idea of teacher recruitment and diverse teacher recruitment. But about that specific program itself, there really just wasn't a lot of good data to tell, was that program even successful? I mean, we like the ideas, we like the mission and the vision of the program, but was the program itself actually that successful? And should we bring back funding for that program, or should we envision that program? And so the lack of data has actually caused me to sort of change my gears in terms of that activism work. And we're reworking the language of that open letter as a result.
Do you guys, when you see data like that that the public hasn't seen, or you get that report, you take a look at something, people haven't seen it, what goes through your mind in terms of like the creativity part of how you're going to make it useful? Like when you think about it, like how will my people take this information? What's the creative part in your mind that you're thinking? I don't think people have an insight on the activist brain in that way. How are you making it meaningful for the people?
So, go ahead, Tanesha.
Either, yeah, go ahead, jump in. Either of you.
You first.
Okay. Well, I mean, for me, I think I'm a researcher of sorts and trained in that. I know that data can be very difficult in terms of extracting. First, you have to know your goal. Like what? Maybe it's not the best way to do it, but I try to develop goals around what we want to achieve. And if the data can be useful in getting there, then fine. But usually because the data is a third source, they're not actually created with the community. We're actually trying to create those kinds of partnerships because we're not in that back end. We're not helping them develop their methods. They're not even asking us, even though we're represented in those numbers, then it has to really meet our goals, not necessarily moved by possibly what the researcher may have intended, which is that they would drive the conversation. So, I mean, for example, we have this question of star ratings in DC, and we know that it's been a real issue this year. We've had an election with our State Board of Education, so it even became more highlighted. And a lot of people were arguing around like why star ratings were not helpful for different reasons. But for special education, I think we are able to own that question probably with more authority than others because our kids are not showing up fairly in there. We can use those kinds of points, right, to help them come to better conclusions around what they do next. And I hope that part of what's next is that we're included in their method and not just being able to use their outcomes for our efforts or goals.
Tanesha, what were you going to say?
Yeah, just to hop in, as an organizer and activist, you have to be really creative around how you engage communities. So I know a few years ago, we were doing a campaign around or to get parents in Chicago to advocate for quality schools, right? And one of the messaging points under that campaign was 143,000 students in Chicago were in failing seats. And so nobody really, not to say that people don't care, but it's like, how do you translate that information to a community, right? And so one day I'm at the gym and I picked 3 guys and I'm like, for 1 minute and 43 seconds, I want y'all to have a push-up contest and we're going to see who wins. Now, in this push-up contest, of course, one of the guys, I'm like, you can't start until the 20-second mark. And then another guy, I'm like, you can't, you're done. You're cut off at 1 minute and 20 seconds. And so, of course, one guy wins the contest and the other guys are left behind. And so that sparks a conversation around quality seats and equity and schools. And I'm like, this is what it means when 143,000 students in Chicago are in failing seats. They don't have the same opportunities, just the same as you guys didn't have the same opportunity or the same start or the equity or equality in this contest. And so that was just an example of how you engage communities around data. You just have to be creative, make it fun, and make it relevant to, what they have going on in life. So yeah, it's just being just being innovative, to engage communities.
I love that example. I think it's too much work, and I'm not trying to be your student ever because I'm not trying to do all that. I do know a few years ago, actually more than a few years ago, actually ranked choice voting was coming to the Twin Cities, and it was really hard to explain to the public what ranked choice voting was. It's still very hard to explain how it works and what it is. And one of the primary organizers around it was masterful. She was great at it. She started having these dessert parties, and she started using desserts as ways to teach you how to vote for different candidates. And I became an expert because I love dessert. So I followed all, I gained weight learning about ranked choice voting, but it was very creative. It actually worked out. It was a very smart way to teach us. I get reports in my email a lot. Every couple of days, I get a report from a friend, a partner, someone. And my question when I'm reading these reports that clog up my email all the time is, what were you expecting to do with this? Like, what did you think was going to happen with this report? Like, okay, I read it, I get it, but what's supposed to happen next? Do you all have that experience where you're reading, information from the information brokers, the folks who are sending you reports, America's this, that, or the other, or this, whatever that they do on your issue, but you're done reading it, you're like at a loss for what they thought was supposed to happen next in doing the report?
Certainly. I mean, so there's a phrase that I like to use, like you have to put wheels on your prayers, right? So the information is great.
Wow. Wait, say this again. Let me stop. Say this again.
You have to put wheels on your prayers, right? Like,
okay,
sort of like a reiteration.
Go ahead.
God help those who help themselves, right? So, I appreciate information and facts, and I've done a fair amount of research myself. I'm a PhD candidate. I've done some different research, but I appreciate when I get a report that has some outcome that is intended, that the authors are seeking in the form of policy recommendations or what have you. And I really appreciate when it's not just something so broad like the recommendation from our findings is that we should invest in communities, or something so broad that you can't possibly do anything with that. Like as an activist, how do you do that? How do you invest in your community? Give me some specific steps. So I appreciate those researchers, those policy wonks and authors who do put some wheels on their prayers and tell us what they want to come as a result of their work.
Natasha, let me ask you real quick. What would you think in the activism that you do, and because you understand information and data and it's part of what you do and what you work with, what do you think could be done better before they get the reports to you when they're writing these big research-based reports? How would it be better for your activism? What could they do better? I think you're on mute, Natasha. I think you're still on mute, but go ahead. Yep, can hear you now. Go ahead.
Hear me? Okay. First, let me say that I'm a very blunt and straight to the point organizer. I've been doing this for years, so it's like I don't, cut any corners, but I'm very, direct with what I'm doing. And it relates to, and I want to kind of go back to, how do I use data to activate people? I do it bluntly. So, for example, if we're saying that 24% of CPS students are not reading proficiently, I'm just telling the people, do you know that 76% of children in CPS are not reading proficiently? Like, let's be blunt about that. And how do you feel about that? How does that impact you? What do you notice about your students' learning or lack thereof or quality of education? So I'm very blunt. But I think that one of the things that is very important when it comes to, data and the policy wonks that created is making sure that it is accessible. I know years ago when I first started this whole just organizing, my babies were little. I'm a parent of 3. It started off with my twins when they were actually before they were born, I was a substitute teacher with CPS. And just my experience in the school system, it was bad, being a substitute teacher. I felt so sorry for the students, and the lack of education they were receiving. But I couldn't really put any numbers on how many kids were being impacted. And then my children went into the system, and I started noticing some of the things that I had seen as a substitute teacher impacting my sons. So then I'm like, okay, where are the numbers? Let me find out what's going on. This can't just be my children. And I remember really digging and trying to find information. It was everywhere. I know CPS didn't really have a warehouse of information that was readily available for parents to be able to access when it came to like data as it relates to their test scores. I couldn't find it. I went to the State Board of Ed. I couldn't find it. But I found bits and pieces all over, like individual reports that people had made at the University of Chicago and other different educational institutions. But I think it's important to be able to house, have things available, and then also connect with some of your local nonprofits that are on the ground and sharing that information with them. They need to be more outward and marketing this knowledge that they're having, or this information that they have, so that people can gain knowledge about the issues that are happening. I would like to say now, though, I will give CPS a little kudos in that now, you can find information, but just like Tanesha said, it's still convoluted, but yeah.
This is one of the reasons that I love activists and I love the information brokers, is because my journey, like yours, started with trying to find information in my own schools and my own situations. And it felt like my state was working against me. It felt like my own state was working against me. I would say to myself all the time, I shouldn't have to have a PhD to find out these things that I'm looking for. And when I would go to the state websites, when I would make phone calls, I came to the conclusion at some point, and this is years ago when all of this was mysterious to me as a dad, as a father. This was all mysterious to me, but I was trying to do my best as a father to learn all that I could. And it felt like the state was my enemy, because when I would go to the websites, I felt like very smart people were trying to make it hard for me to educate myself on what they were doing with kids. The numbers didn't seem to make sense. The tools, just the tools themselves, like to find out how are my kids doing, felt like a NASA question. And I just want to say, like, putting a lot of pressure on our then Commissioner of Education, to their credit over time. I said to her, like the Denzel quote, there's a quote in one of his movies where he's like, now explain this to me like an 8th grader, right? Explain this to me like I'm in 8th grade. And it felt like that was the first time they had ever heard a question like that. Y'all got to stop talking on this jargon. You have to stop, like it's almost like you're doing it on purpose to insult us or something. And I know they don't think that, maybe they don't think that way, but this is why I love folks like you all, because I had to start asking other people, like real people, can you help me understand this? Like, can you help me get this? You guys are all shaking your heads. So you must at some point, I wasn't alone, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that really resonates, as an education advocate. I mean, I'm an activist, but, I also support individual families and, exercising their individual rights around getting their kids evaluated and their needs met. And a big part of that is that information gathering. I mean, they're the processes of, like, you have to do a full records request. You have a right to every single piece of data that's in your school's file. But what you really don't have a right for is, like, the standards used to measure your child's intelligence. Like, I'm really big on method, right? Like, and as a parent of 2 children with autism, it's really important to understand things beyond what I think are currently used as metrics of intelligence, or even supporting kids in having, quality life, joining a workforce with a variety of different goals. I mean, that's the end goal, right? So our methods should speak to our goals, not our goals speak to our methods. And again, that backwards process creates a lot of problems and leads to a huge dropout rate for a lot of kids who show up differently in the school system, like my own, and families like my own that may not know how to, kind of get what they need out of the system in order to not lose their minds and in order to get their kids what they need, especially right now with COVID. And so many things are up in the air, but the system is not honest enough to say they don't know. So the masking and the access is so much harder now than I think even before now.
That's a really good point, Garris. Is this showing up in Kentucky at all? This, you're a PhD candidate, you've had to deal with data, you've had to, I'm sure, look at public records. Do you feel like your state and your kind of your ecosystem of information demystifies well for average people?
So I certainly think that we've improved over the past couple of years. Of course, under ESSO, we have a new school accountability system in Kentucky. And with that, we have a new school report card site that was launched about 2 years ago. And I feel like it really does an outstanding job of breaking down school performance in different communities for families who otherwise may not have had access to that information, or like you pointed out, it was so wonky that you needed a master's degree in statistics to understand. And so certainly I think that we've progressed beyond that ancient school report card site and some of those sort of metrics. And so I'm really happy about the direction that we're moving in. But to speak to that point, I think that what you said is so powerful and so true. A parent certainly shouldn't have to have a PhD to understand what's going on with their children's learning and what's going on in their children's schools. And so I think that for me, I write for Education Post. And so when I started writing, I didn't really even understand that because I'm in the system, I'm entrenched. And so the way that I started writing and communicating my work was still that wonky style. And it took a little while to get out of the habit of that. And so I say that to say, I don't think that education reporters and writers do this intentionally, but I think it's just part of the system that we're so entrenched in. And I think maybe it speaks to a larger need for educators and for policy types to really interact more with parents and people who are on the ground, because they don't understand what the needs are.
Yeah, I want to call something out. I want to call a thing a thing. I think that there is a lot of educational elitism and class-based elitism. And I think a lot of the knowing class have secret handshakes that show up in terms of language, show up in terms of how they write. All these Greek letters and coefficients and all that type of stuff. That's great. That's beautiful. That's wonderful. If you want to be like the old Latin from years ago where you had the Bible and no one else knew what it said. And I think it's incumbent upon regular people who care about the people, the real people, to actually be careful translators and information brokers, because they know that the educated class is purposely speaking in a language that they're talking to themselves. Boom, 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 talking to each other.
Can I add to that? So there is an
absolutely
academic term called diglossia, right? Like that literally defines that, like where legislation and legislature are coded. If you look at like the law, there's a whole study of tort. I mean, you have to know tort to really understand a lot of how these laws are coded, or even the outline of how they're written. And then policy on the local level, of course, federally, they're all written in that very grand language, but locally they can be translated differently if they're working with researchers that can help to translate it for the people. But we don't have those brokers. Love you too, baby. But we don't have those brokers. That's fun, right? We don't have those brokers that help the people understand, to translate. And the glossia does speak of disparities, that it is purposeful around elitism, as you said. So I am committed to decolonizing information, and it is a colonial process to keep the oppressed oppressed. I mean, there's a whole history around the glossia and how it's been used to disenfranchise, indigenous people from, the laws of the land that are now imposed on them. But we are at a time where we can, and I hope our researchers can take the charge to be those brokers. But I don't know if academia is training researchers to understand that that is a real role, that that's a real need. They need to get out of the ivory tower and support us differently.
I want to even say like our ed reform partners need to get out of. I love this term. Say this term again, Chioma, because actually I'm not familiar with it.
Diglossia.
Diglossia. I'm glad to name things and call things, what they are. But some of our ed reform partners, I think, even when it's unintentional a lot of times. So I don't want to say bad people. Like I have and I don't want to give too much detailed information because I don't want to call somebody out who had what I felt like was a really great report. But I got a report that had amazing information in it, that had a startling conclusion about kids of color and specifically Black kids. And it was buried in so much other stuff that I had to read it 5 times. And then I had to call and say, can we talk about it? And then I had to ask questions, and then I had to go read it again. And listen to all that I'm saying right now. I'm like, God damn, this is too much work, right? Like at some point, I'm doing your work for you. And what killed me about it was there was a conclusion in that report that was devastating for Black children, right? And it was buried beneath a lot of fluff, or I don't know if you would call it fluff, but other stuff. Have you all had this experience in reading through some of these reports and thinking to like, I should have wrote this for you, or you should have had me involved in the process earlier?
Can I jump in, Chris? Because
I think you're on mute, Tanesha. Oh, there you go. Yep, there you go.
Admittedly, I haven't been a fan of data and reports for that reason. It just makes it too difficult to find the information. And I get distracted easily. And so to go and ask 1,000 questions about how to interpret something is not my thing, but I recognize how necessary it is in fighting this battle. But I also wish that qualitative data had more value in research and data reports. Like someone asked in the chat, I'm sorry, how do you balance the use of data with human stories and infovism to support advocacy? When you're doing research around a particular community, it's invaluable, or those voices are invaluable. And I think that, the fact that those voices have been excluded from the research and reports themselves is doing a disservice to the community that you're trying to service. And so, to include that qualitative data, which has always been my favorite, with the quantitative data is very important. And also just really getting the input of maybe as an educational experience or some kind of learning curve, maybe including those people from the community in that research process. And so maybe it's an internship or something, I don't know, but to actually include the voices of the people that you're researching in that process is something that's absolutely necessary. That qualitative data is necessary. So don't ignore that piece with the numbers. And that's how you engage more people, because you're actually telling their stories in that data rather than just regurgitating a lot of numbers that they probably heard before. Personally, I don't need a data point to tell me that the people that live around me are struggling. I see it every day. I've struggled. So I don't need your numbers to tell me that, but I can go blocks away and hear the same story. So don't forget that qualitative data piece.
That's a really powerful part. Really powerful part. Just never forget storytelling is important. Like, it's the thing that we pay attention to at Brightbeam and at EdPost. You can talk in numbers all you want, but when you talk in a real story, stories are eternal. It goes back to the beginning of time. Stories are important, and stories have a 3-act structure: a beginning, a middle, and an end. Some people don't know how to tell a story, so I just want to be real about that. Garris, what were you going to say? I didn't mean to cut you off, man.
Oh, you're fine. So in Kentucky a few years ago, the Kentucky Department of Education began to place a great deal of emphasis on students' mental health and on suicide prevention. And of course, those are issues that have been around for years. But this particular year, they placed a great deal of emphasis in an initiative. And I remember the Commissioner of Education saying that he was aware of the statistics and the facts and the information. But what launched that initiative was a specific story that he had heard of a youth suicide in a specific community. And it wasn't until he had heard that story shared by that family and shared by those community members that it really weighed upon him to start that initiative. So I think that's a powerful example right there of just narrative. If you can envelop the data and the facts and the information in a narrative, it can really drive the point home and really spur action.
Yeah, I love the power of the single story too, in some cases, to start an entire thing. I traveled the country last year and the year before, last couple of years, and I was being bothered by something, and I didn't know that I was seeing a story and a pattern. And I started telling the story in speeches, just kind of organically. It came out of me to say, I'm going to all these different cities. I'm recognizing a pattern. I'm seeing that there's all this like new lifestyles, new ways of eating, condos going up, lots of gentrification, lots of stuff happening and bustling. And in the middle of all these people drinking their fancy coffee and their great wine and their great dinners are these like groups of kids, these faces at the bottom of the well who are never going to live that lifestyle in their cities. And I'm seeing it everywhere, from Seattle to San Francisco to Austin to the Twin Cities. And I can keep going down the list. And I was telling that story not as a story, not as a device. It was an observation. But I got to see that so many people were like, that you're exactly talking to my city. And it would be a different city than I was talking to. They're like, that's going on in my city. The condos are going up. The price and rent are going up. All these college educated people are moving in. They're enjoying themselves. They're loving it to death. And a couple of blocks away from all this like lovely stuff going on, there are these sections. Every city has its sections, and those sections are never going to enjoy that. That story, I think, did much better than the data, because the data started showing us that the kids in those cities were doing horrible. Like the mayors in those cities should be ashamed of themselves, but the data wouldn't do justice on, have you seen condos popping up in your city? Have you seen the yoga mats coming in? Do you have the bike trails jumping in? Is your level of coffee getting better? And people were like all saying yes. Now, Garris, this ain't gonna work with you because you're in rural Kentucky. So
yeah, but here's the thing, though. It's the same process, though. It's the same thing that's happening. It looks a little bit different, right? But in rural America, we're having similar issues. We have a phenomenon called brain drain, where those who are from small town USA, rural America, they feel pressure to leave and to flock to these cities because that's where everyone's going. Those are the it cities. Like in Kentucky, you go to Louisville, you go to Nashville. And because you have no opportunities in rural America, unless you work in healthcare or you work for a school district, there are no jobs. And so it is the same thing because business and workforce and education are so heavily intertwined. And we don't have one of those. We don't have the workforce here. We're losing the industry. Mm-hmm. And so what does that spell for education?
So there is a story even there that would be told. Like you would tell a story and it would resonate with local people.
Absolutely. And you know what? Right now, as I think of it, I can name names and see faces of people that I went to high school with and people that I went to college with who faced this same experience. And I chose to stay. And this is neither here nor there, but it's the same experience. It just looks a little different for those of us out here in the country. But it's interesting. And it speaks to the power of education as a change agent in the lives of our youth.
So let me ask you guys a question. Dina Reppin, who is watching this, and Dina, I hope I'm doing justice by your name. I mentioned to folks earlier today, I'm terrible with names, but Dina Reppin is asking a question about how you handle misinformation when there's a lot of data out there or facts, so-called facts in air quotes, that are going through a community. So Tanesha or Chioma or Natasha or Garris, you're out there trying to do something, but you encounter a data fact that is commonly believed in the public or in your community, and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe we're having to defeat that one. How do you approach a situation where the data and the facts out there are wrong?
Yeah, I mean, so in DC, we have a very active Twitterverse, and for good or for bad, I think it's an easy channel to challenge ideas, establish different analysis of information. I think what I experience more is limited scope of analysis more than false data. Like, I mean, this is a very wonky town and there are people who know a lot of things, but the issue is that, they just don't have the intelligence, dare I say, to interpret it in the interest of the people. So it's always good to try and spin the narrative. I mean, we write op-eds, we write, we're on Twitter as much as the next person. We're adding everybody that needs to be added. We're engaging, we're agitating. We know the principles of organizing is educate, agitate, organize, organize, organize. So we know that a big part of what social media can do is help with that agitation piece. And there's so much we don't know. And I never, even as I have a PhD, I never want to create a situation where what we're challenging is who got the numbers right. What we really want to challenge is who is creating the opportunities for change, for real felt progressive change in a, and I know progressive is a loaded word. It means a million different things, but change that actually matters in the bread and butter kind of a way. We have a lot more difficulty in getting those who are the wonky people to understand what their information is supposed to be doing for the people. So I think we find much more of opportunity to challenge. I do want to say, lastly, to Tanesha's earlier point, participatory research is a thing. So some of these can be backdoor conversations. Funders can really motivate research by enforcing that in order to get funds. I mean, they do this now where they say you have to work collaboratively with other organizations. It's not just you that's eating all, that you're not the only single person that's enacting a fund. Well, that can happen in research as well. I think while we're punching up with a retweet or, a crafty little liner, or we're able to get our ideas out there, what would really go the distance is to be able to sit in these backdoor conversations and talk about in a participatory way. And not everybody's interested in the method. Sometimes it's just a report back. Before you publish, before you go to publish, can you share your data with the people who it's impacting the most, just to make sure you got it right and that it speaks to who needs it the most? So I think Twitter does give us an opportunity to start that conversation, but we're not going to get a lot further if we're not actually collaborating in the research process.
I think it's such an important point. My colleague on 8 Black Hands, Dr. Charles Cole, when he was doing his doctorate, he was doing his final dissertation work. He was basically, he was wanting to write his dissertation in a way that the Black mothers in his community would be able to be the first to understand it and get it. And he had to actually fight in the process to be able to write his dissertation that way. His dissertation, he tells the story, his dissertation is on the Black achievement tax. He studied 4 Black men that had made it all the way up to, I think, PhD level, but they came through the crack epidemic, they came through other things, and there was this supposedly you've made it type of thing, but no one had dealt with the trauma of making it, and he wrote a story about it, but he said, I want my dissertation to be able, I want the mothers of Oakland to be able to read my dissertation and have it make sense to them about their own lives, but he had to actually fight in the dissertation process, actually, to have that be true. I don't think that should be a fight that we should have to make data and research realistic. Garris, do you have a thought about, like, when you're thinking about rural Kentucky, even, and you're a PhD student, the work that you're doing about making it real for the people? I mean, you're participating in, I forget Chioma's word already, deglossia. You're going to participate in the deglossia right now. How are you going to make it real for real people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't know that about Charles Cole and his dissertation. I haven't done my dissertation yet, but I think that's a powerful thing because, when I think about research, I want there to be a change that comes out of it, right? I want the research to drive positive change in the world. And, the world around me probably isn't going to be able to understand a PhD level dissertation, that kind of language, because it is so written from this ivory tower perspective that we've mentioned. So I think that's a powerful idea, and hopefully that'll change moving forward. I'd like to see, just in general, research becoming more friendly, like more consumable. And I think we're beginning to see that. Like, if you look on Twitter, there are a lot more graphics coming out from like universities and different scholars, and it's a lot more consumable, just the way that they highlight certain statistics and key facts. And so I think that the tide is turning in that. It's not turning fast enough, perhaps, but I think that we're making some real change there.
Jessica Lawrence here is asking a question about, can any of us talk about how we've used the ESSA report cards to engage communities or to identify the information that parents and families find the most important? And I would love to hear if any of y'all even touched that, or if if the ESSA report cards became a thing in your life. My very short experience was spending a year trying to make sense of it myself and helping others make sense of what it all meant. And then watching funders kick out a bunch of funds to different organizations to try and engage communities around it, and not seeing it have the impact that I think all that money should have had. But open question to you all. Did you work with ESSA? Did you see the report cards? Did you use them with communities at all?
Yeah, I referred to that earlier when I mentioned the star rating system. I didn't explain what that meant. Our star rating system is our ESSA report card. And, we do have a, fairly sophisticated and progressive process. We have a very great Nobel Prize winning tool used for my school, DC, to make these determination. And the star ratings are posted publicly on the My School DC website to help families make informed decisions around choosing schools. The challenge, like I mentioned before, I just explained it better, this year that we found is that, of course, there was already pushback with that process because, to some degree, it's correct. I think it could be critically assessed better than I think the average analysis is out here around it. Part of the issues with the STAR is that it, misclassifies, or the methods that they use kind of enacted by our state office misclassifies like what people, like how you view a high need school, or when a school gets a low rating, like what that actually can mean. And from a deficit model, of course, there's that, you're pegging the school as bad, it's going to impact enrollment. So it's so political that we're not actually able to benefit from having objective analysis as to what it produces. So I think we can revamp, and I think we have a newly elected state board with new seats. And I think part of the mandate has been to revamp our STAR system. So for students with disabilities, and we do use that information, a little craftily, and saying that we want the people to recognize that our kids are not showing up in this anyways. Like, however you're rating these schools, you're not even using special education data, because it would even be worse. It would be worse than what you're looking at now. We want more accurate data and more useful data and better ways so it doesn't feel punitive, to be able to be honest about the reality of what's happening, and why a school may be considered low, a 1-star, because it doesn't have the reading, the math levels, and what do we do with it next? The ... is where we go now, and also revamping who is included in the rating system, so we have even a better accurate view of what's going on.
I want to ask you guys kind of a provocative question. This is going to see how truthful you guys actually are, because I know y'all consider yourselves some truth tellers. So let's hear it. When it comes to the way that data is used in the public and data on the ground, there is a version of a crisis actor who is a bad actor in the community with data sometimes. Sometimes there are organizing forces trying to miseducate the public for a political reason. Sometimes the public employees don't want to change in the schools. Sometimes their friends and allies in the nonprofits that they fund don't want there to be a change in the schools. Are we going to call a thing? Or are we just going to call it out that, yes, we need honest information brokers to be out there on the ground, but one of the things that they're going to battle are dishonest data brokers who are like crisis actors. They show up in a community with an agenda, and they take the data and they're using it in a dishonest way. Are we going to call that out?
If I can just
I think you're on mute, Tanesha. Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me? Okay. So, Chris, you know me.
Yep, I can hear you.
Back in Chicago, back in 2013, we had the 50 school closures, right? I'm not a fan of the teachers union here. I'll say it in this conference. A lot of people know that. If you read my pieces, you know that. Because I wouldn't say that they're dishonest. I just sometimes think they don't tell the whole truth, and maybe that is considered dishonesty. But there was no conversation about how a lot of those schools had been underperforming for so many years. And I feel like their battle was because if those schools closed, and they would lose obviously a lot of their membership. And it wasn't for the families and the students on the south and west sides of Chicago where those closures mostly happen. And so, yeah, we have to call them out, because when you don't tell the full story of what's happening, and you don't talk about the data or the history of the data, the history of the facts, then the story can get twisted, and we still don't see that change. And so where we had so many of those schools underperforming, we still have a lot of schools underperforming because that conversation flew under the radar. And so we have to call those people out for not telling the truth. And we have to, in turn, tell the truth ourselves, no matter what kind of pushback we get as activists.
And I just want to jump on what Tanesha just said, just to not leave her out there. I too am very critical of the Chicago Teachers Union and their tactics. So I know there was a question regarding how do we deal with misinformation with data. And I don't know if it's just being false, but I think that what they do is they don't tell the complete picture when it comes to using the data. They use just portions of it to feed into their narrative, which oftentimes further the education divide, in particular from the Black community. And for me, my goal is to use the accurate data to focus specifically on why we need to really create our own lane and not necessarily always jump on to what the teachers union are saying, because they're not always addressing our specific needs. And so, yeah, that I would say that they would be the culprit in Chicago, and things that, you know, information is just completely not in a picture that's inclusive of every.
Chris,
I want to agree. Wow. Oh,
I just wanted to add on, just as a disclaimer, I was not a fan, nor did I support the closure of 50 schools in Chicago. But again, if we're talking about organizing communities, we have to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. And so to have parents understand the situation in the schools, the failure of the system, of the district itself, we could have possibly saved those schools in our communities, and our communities wouldn't be in the positions that they're in today. So I just want that to be clear, to understand why it's important to for that information to be available and to tell the truth, so that we can organize communities around that change.
Yeah.
And this is a thing too. I'm sorry.
No.
I was going to say, and this is the thing just to add, you know, as a substitute teacher with Chicago Public Schools, I worked on and off for 6 years. And one of the things that I noticed and had experienced was the impact our children had on just, well, the lack of the teacher's presence in the classrooms, their impact on children. My sister and I both sub, and one of the things we would do when we would come home, we would debrief our stories of how just almost sad it was for our students. And we knew that on Mondays, Thursdays, and Fridays, we had a job because teachers just didn't show up. But even more disheartening was 2 summers straight, I had to teach 6th and 3rd grade because majority of the students in those benchmark years failed the Illinois standard test because their teachers didn't show up. So when we look at data and I see that there's this gap, it actually is equal to what my experience was within the school system. And oftentimes, you know, there's not groups that's really addressing that issue, you know, and so I think it's very important that we, you know, talk about what's factual and how we use our data to be able to hone in on specific groups that are impacted by other people's decisions.
Yeah, and you know, just to add on to it, I think in the realm of special education, I can't say that the teachers union or any other power block in the District of Columbia have any real authority over this question. So it's a unique platform to really be objective and be critical from a family-centered perspective on the issue and how we use information. I've challenged, you know, I think, so there is like these 2 camps in DC of like charter and teachers union and all this drama with that. But what happens is there's this huge silence when it comes to talking about things like school discipline and the outcomes and the disproportionate targeting of Black and brown kids and Black and brown kids with disabilities and the low and the abysmal graduation rates for this particular population. I have never gotten into a conversation around the data where anyone has disputed. You can use whatever numbers, they all look bad, where any one of them can dispute the facts of this case and the policies that mandate better usage. Good thing too is it's heavily regulated federally in terms of what information you can use. I think it's not used enough within education reform, and I wish there could be more interest in special education because it really diffuses. When we talk about education outcomes, it's not going to get any worse than special education outcomes. And the union is not prepared to make any critical position. For example, like right now, we had a council hearing yesterday on reopening the schools. City council called a hearing, on a panel. I wasn't on that panel. I was on the panel after, where the teachers union president was on there, and one of the council members specifically asked, like, what is your position on the highest needs kids, most vulnerable kids? You're asking for X, Y, and Z before schools can reopen. Do you have a position on what can happen to provide, accommodations to students who need it? Do you agree that they should open schools for them first? Of course, they have this very cookie cutter position, but what became clear in reading between the lines is they don't have an informed position, period. And their mission right now is to go behind and say that they're going to deliver a platform and a mandate to our DCPS to be able to LEA, District of Columbia Public Schools, to be able to make that mandate, which is the only LEA that they have any real influence over. That is behind the bar. Like, we're in December. Schools have been open since August. I mean, this is the last of your priority. You don't even have a position on the question, but you're like pounding pavement around reopening schools or not reopening schools, missing the point. So I think they, along with all the other power players, are behind the ball on this population. What they do with I don't think they can even fudge it, right? Like in any state, by the way, not just DC, in any state.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this is where we're going to have to rest. We came to an hour with my friends Chioma, Tanesha, Garris, Natasha. I want to thank you all for participating in this today, and for the people that have watched and provided questions. I think my kind of final word on all this, Chioma said the diglossia. Don't be part of the group of people that are very smart and producing very smart information that no one can use. If you have reports that you want to move the world with, or you want to move something with, involve people from the beginning in helping you understand, why are you doing this research? What do you want to happen with it? What do you expect the community to get out of it? Ask yourself a set of critical questions, but don't just ask yourself. Have people on the ground, activists, people who will need the information to use it, be part of your process. When you're done with it and you're producing it, involve activists all the way through the process, all the way along, and then develop the key stories that you want to tell with the data. Because maybe if you're thinking of that from the beginning, you won't pull together a bunch of meaningless facts that don't tell a story in the end. So if we had some 1-2 punches here, it's 1, involve activists in the community as part of your research that you're doing. 2, make sure that you're asking yourself the question of what you want to happen with it. Many of us get your reports and we don't know what to do with it. Make it easy for activists to understand. Send them a package, not just the report, not just a PDF and here's the report and read it for yourself. If you can, send visuals, send graphics, send activist tools, send thumbnails, social media kind of packages. You do this for journalists sometimes. You make it easy for them to write the story. Do it also for activists. Send them a package with the information. So with that said, thank you to my brightbeam family here. I appreciate you all. Have a lovely, lovely holiday season. Whatever you celebrate it well. Do it twice. Do it for me. I appreciate you all. Have a great day. To the ExcelinEd people, as always, you guys are top drawer quality friends and partners in this fight, and we appreciate you.